Yeah, if we say in the beginning today, most Christians would complete that with, God created the heavens and the earth. But for most secularists, when you say in the beginning, a natural association that they would make is, of course, the Big Bang. But
Right.
a lot of Christians have not thought through the theistic implications or the theological implications of the Big Bang. And I'm curious as to how really dedicated materialists like Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking avoided those implications.
It really is amazing. It's so disingenuous. I mean, Stephen Hawking, he's one of the ones that popularized the Big Bang in the beginning, his famous book, A Brief History of Time and whatnot. He popularized it until suddenly he realized, I'm not sure what moment he realized, the theistic implication that if there's a Big Bang, there must be a Big Banger. Because in fact, there is nothing before the Big Bang. The Big Bang didn't just create matter. The Big Bang created matter and space and time. Before the Big Bang, there was nothing. And I think at some point he suddenly realized, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And then he started doing, I'm sorry, this is not even science. This is science fiction. One of the things that Stephen Hawking did, and others have jumped in on it, but he tried to get around the theistic implications of there was a beginning to the universe and there was nothing before that beginning. The way he got around it was by theorizing what he called multiverse theory, multiple universe, multiverse theory. And he's like, oh yeah, it is impossible for a universe just to pop out of nowhere, right? Because, literally, the odds of getting what we have by chance, the odds actually exceeds the number of atoms in the universe. The odds would be literally like throwing a dart and hitting one atom in the entire universe. Okay, that just doesn't happen. But he theorized, what if an infinite number of universes are always popping into being, popping, dying, back and forth? If that were the case, then the odds would be okay that one of those universes would be the kind that we have that allows for human life, or life of any kind, but especially of human life. Now, this is what the people who speak Yiddish would call chutzpah, okay? You cannot explain how one universe came into being by chance, and so you get out of that by theorizing that billions of them came out of nowhere.
Madness.
So this is how they get away with it is unbelievable. But, to the day he died, he kept trying. Now, later, in the 5 years or so before he died, then he started coming up with other theories. He said, well, okay, all we really need, right, for order is the law of gravity. If we have the law of gravity, that can organize things. Okay, first of all, there's two problems there. Number one, there is nothing before the Big Bang. Now, all of a sudden, he's suggesting the law of gravity. There's nothing before the Big Bang. But even beyond that, again, the modern secularist has this way of taking words like gravity, nature, and chance and imbuing them with some kind of consciousness and ability to do things. The law of gravity doesn't do anything. In fact, the law of gravity has no meaning until there is physical matter that's moving. So you can't have a law of gravity before the Big Bang because there's nothing. The law of gravity measures something. It doesn't actually cause stones to fall to earth. It merely is a law that measures that attractive power. So he keeps getting. One of my favorite ones, though, is Carl Sagan. Now, again, if you're my age, or if you've been around for a while, you'll remember. I guess it must have been around 1980, 1979, when Carl Sagan came out with the famous show called Cosmos, which has been rebooted. Right, that deGrasse Tyson, whatever his name is, I think
Yes.
he rebooted it. But the original Cosmos, again, that way when we watched that on PBS, everybody was glued to their television sets on Sunday night. Now, Carl Sagan began that show with a famous phrase that he seems to think is scientific, but is absolutely metaphysical and philosophical. He began by saying the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Now, first of all, you realize that that's a very kind of nasty stealing of Revelation chapter 4, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty who was and is to come. Now, suddenly the cosmos is all there ever is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. But here's the problem with that statement. Now, in the year 1980, regular dudes like you and I did not know that the Big Bang had been proven. It hadn't quite made its way into popular culture. But by 1980, any scientist who was in the inn, like Carl Sagan, knew. But long before 1980, they had already basically proven the Big Bang because they saw the universe was expanding. They even found what's called the smoking gun, the background radiation. So Carl Sagan himself knew about the Big Bang. And yet he makes this unbelievably disingenuous thing saying the cosmos is all there ever was. He's still going back. Okay, throughout the 20th century, a lot of top scientists, including and especially Einstein, fiercely resisted what he saw. He noticed that the universe was expanding. He knew what this meant. If it was expanding from a point, it must have started. And Einstein himself fiercely resisted the idea that the universe had a beginning because he knew what the implications were. And he even came up with what he would later call a fudge factor to try to explain away the expansion of the universe. And later on, he admitted it was probably the biggest scientific mistake he'd made. They wanted to believe in the 20th century in what they called the steady state theory, the belief that the universe or cosmos has always been here. And again, that's been, as much as science can disprove anything, has been disproven. The universe has a beginning, and that beginning came out of nothing. So suddenly, in the beginning, God becomes a sort of scientific statement. It's funny how things come around.
What I find absolutely fascinating, and this simply revisits the power of meta-narrative, when I read minds as bright as Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking, I keep coming up against what I call Houdini hermeneutics.
I love that.
They are so committed to the ABT position, anything but theism. They just absolutely cannot allow a divine foot in the door, that they will bend and distort, filter, refract, state metaphysical statements in an effort to make them scientific, and they're unaware of their own encapsulation. I don't know where you are on the two books position, but I am unashamedly a two-booker. Believing that God has written two books. He's the author of the book of his works, or nature, and also the book of his word, Revelation. And yet I continue to see consistent errors among what I would call the one-bookers, those who believe only in science or only in the Bible. And I guess a question that I would have is, why is it smart in today's increasingly scientific climate for Christians to be conversant with both books?
I think they need to. And God reveals himself. What we need to remember as Christians is something, and this is great because what I'm going to talk about now is absolutely clear both in Aquinas and in Calvin. Okay, and if those guys can agree on something, I think maybe that's pretty important. Okay, and at the very center of Christian theology is the distinction between general revelation and special revelation. Okay, this is not only key to Catholic theology, this is the way Calvin begins his Institutes. Also, this is the way the book of Romans begins. The difference is general revelation is the way that God speaks to all people at all times. He speaks specifically through two things, through his creation, through nature, and through our conscience. C.S. Lewis would add that he speaks through the good dreams of the pagans as well, right? That God speaks to all people. That's why in Romans chapter 1, we are without excuse because God's nature and glory and power is completely on display in his creation. And that's why in Romans chapter 2, Paul tells us that even the Gentiles who are without the law are a law unto themselves, for the law has been written in their heart, ultimately has been written in their conscience. So it's very clear in the Bible and in biblical theology that God speaks through general revelation, but he also speaks through special revelation. That's when he speaks directly through the Old Testament, the New Testament, the prophets, and supremely through Christ. And we need to pay attention to both. When we speak about natural law, we're really speaking about God's general revelation, the way God speaks to all people through conscience and through nature. And we need to study that, right? Let me kind of put this in a wonderful way. Psalm 19, which was C.S. Lewis's favorite psalm, begins, "The heavens are telling the glory of the Lord. The skies are proclaiming his handiwork," right? God does speak through his creation. But what's really neat about that psalm is the first half of the psalm talks about nature. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they are not silent, their voice is going out to all the world. But the second half of that psalm moves away from nature and starts talking about the law, the Torah. And what's really cool is in the first half of the psalm, when it's talking about nature, the word used for God, the heavens are telling the glory of the Lord, is the word Elohim, the sort of generic word for God, like we use our own word, God. It's generic, right? But as soon as we start, the psalmist starts talking about the law, it switches to Yahweh, God's covenant name, right? So God speaks to us directly by his covenant name in the law, but he still speaks to us more generally in our conscience and through creation. And we need to access both of those books if we are going to dialogue. Just like Christians are realizing, we need to speak the language of natural law if we are going to engage the secular humanist in the marketplace of ideas, in what was called the naked public square. Richard John Newhouse called the naked public square. Now, unfortunately, Larry, for a long time, a lot of Protestants, like myself, evangelicals, Calvinists, a lot of us were a little bit leery about natural law because we saw it as more of a Catholic idea. But it's not just a Catholic idea, it's a Christian idea. And slowly and thankfully, more and more Christians in the public square are realizing that we can make connections, we can build a bridge by pointing to things like the natural law and pointing to great. Now, hopefully on a one-on-one basis, we may be able to slowly draw people from that natural law into Christ himself. But in terms of the marketplace, in terms of talking to academia, this is a good bridge that we can build and we can begin the conversation. And we need to understand that whatever the secular humanists are saying, almost every major discovery in science in the last 50 years has actually pointed to God and pointed to theism. So if we would be, brave enough to look at that, we would have an incredible ground where we can dialogue.